Welcome to Real Estate Investing Abundance, the show for busy, fulfilled professionals like you to learn how to develop financial independence built on solid, passive real estate investments. Now, here is your host, Dr. Alan Lomax.
Hello, enlightened investors. I'm your host, Dr. Alan. Delighted that you've joined us today. Are you a busy professional, passionate about the work of your calling, yet realize that even though you love what you are doing, you're exchanging your time for money? You know that if you were to lose the ability to exchange time for money, your financial well-being will be in jeopardy. If you can relate, I have great news. Steve Tucker Capital is an investment company designed for professionals to develop financial independence built on solid, passive real estate investments. Remove the anxiety of an uncertain financial future and go to stevetucker.com. Get your free one-page 10-step guide to passive real estate investing. Enlightened investors, there is no dispute that there is a low income and workforce housing shortage. The challenges of addressing that issue are complex and multi-layered. Today, we are going to explore how we as investors can be part of the solution and master the challenges of low-income housing without going broke in the process. Through years of experience and having an engineering background, our guest, Sep Bekam, brought systems into an industry that needed it, and through implementation of his system, he provides investors with abundant opportunities in extremely low-income housing. I am excited to go into this interview with Sep. But Sep, before we get into that, share with us a memorable experience from your formative years that shaped how you are today.
Thank you, Alan. It's a pleasure to be here. One experience that comes to mind is basically, it's a lesson on history and economics at an early age. I was never really interested in either of those subjects during school, mainly because it was kind of forced upon us, right? I was one of those students, like I didn't enjoy something unless I actually went and saw it to find the answer myself. So I just remember early on, my dad used to have, he still does actually, he has a matchbook collection. And he first came to the US right before the overthrow of the Shah. I think it was the 1979 Islamic nation of Iran. So he fled, he immigrated to the US, and he was going to school for his engineering degree. And ever since then, he's been collecting matches. And, smoking used to be popular back then. He used to smoke, he doesn't anymore. But he would have these big, giant containers, and he would show them to my brother and I. And it's just really interesting when you see just over time, some of these companies like hotels, restaurants, or even places that would sell suits, clothing, they would put their prices on there. And this is before the inflation started to really kick in the 70s and 80s. And he would share them with me. And my brother, it was just fascinating. I remember there was one in particular where it showed the cost of a 10-piece suit for $27.50. And that's brand new. That's the hat. Think of the hat like Americans would wear in the 40s and 50s, just very classy. Tie, the suit, and the shoes and everything, right? And nowadays, you might be able to get maybe the tie for the $27.50, but the rest of it, a couple $100, maybe even $1,000 to get a decent quality. And he would share that not necessarily like the cause of it, but just the fact of what like the prices used to be when he first came to the country compared to now. And he said like he was working as a chef for $2.20 an hour in 1977. And that was able to cover his engineering tuition costs and for him to support my mom while they were both going to college. Back then, the tuition at Cal State Long Beach over here in California was $40 per unit. And now it's probably over 10 times that. So textbooks were a fraction of the costs back then, under $100 for the entire college education. And that's without any student loan debt. So he's working minimum wage and he's able to put himself through school. And the big takeaway from that was just the decline of the purchasing power. That same civil engineering degree today, whether it's even an American or a first generation immigrant, to support that on even minimum wage, right? Let alone the cost of living in the same area. And it just made me realize that I got to find ways to stay ahead of the devaluing of the dollar. I just didn't know how until I was in my 20s, until a friend had recommended I read a book that talked more about inflation and the Federal Reserve. And that led me on the path of real estate investing, because the books kind of helped me connect the dots that if you invest in real assets, gold, silver, businesses, mining companies, or passive income real estate, you can stay ahead of the inflation and actually benefit from the inflation. But then if I just put the focus on my job, then I basically have to keep trading time for money and try to hopefully out earn inflation or the real inflation rate, basically what the government doesn't tell us.
What a graphic illustration. A 10-piece suit for $20. And this was was this in the 60s or 50s that this matchbook came from?
Yeah, the matchbook, I think that was from, and I actually have a picture of it over here. I don't see the date on it. I think the suit and that matchbook was probably from about 100 years ago.
Yeah.
So that one was an antique. So I'm assuming in the 70s, that same suit, maybe $70, $100, if that, it wouldn't cost $300 or $1,000.
Yeah, you're right, though. Probably today. I mean, you couldn't get a good silk tie for $20 today. I'm guessing somewhere in the range of a cheap silk tie in the range of $50, a good silk tie, $100+. And you're right. Yeah, just a two-piece suit is probably going to run you $300 or so, is my guess. So quite a difference. And your father supporting himself and his wife on a minimum wage job while he was going to school and putting both of them through school. There is no way you're going to get yourself and your wife through school on a minimum wage job in this day and age. Here in Western North Carolina, we have a program that for some schools, there are designated schools in the North Carolina system that are tuition free. That is tuition, that is not including books, and that does not cover fees. And so it would be difficult for a person to go through school, even in these tuition-free institutions, on a minimum wage job. In fact, it would probably be almost impossible. So things have changed considerably. Right. And one reason that the student loan debt is, I think, over $3 trillion, something like that, because it's just not possible to do what you could even 30 years ago. It's not going to happen. So this aspect of workforce housing is a crisis. And supposedly that when there is a crisis, there is opportunity. I'm not sure that's always the case, but oftentimes crisis does bring opportunity if you're looking in the right direction. And you have brought about a system in terms of operating real estate businesses like factories. Talk us through your system and how, in particular, that is being able to apply to low-income housing and workforce housing, which are some of the most challenging aspects of the housing industry.
Sure. If I can start off with just sharing a couple quick statistics on the need for the workforce housing, especially on the lower end. So before COVID, the National Low-Income Housing Coalition came out with a report and it found that the U.S. had a shortage of 7 million rental homes affordable and available to extremely low-income families. So they haven't published the data post-COVID, but I'm willing to bet with the way lumber prices are going, with the way material costs are going, labor costs, and it just becoming more expensive to provide housing units, that shortage is probably going to go up. And the second aspect of it is that 80% of all new construction housing units income of $75,000 or more per year. So if a tenant's earning $30K per year, they'll get a benefit. The more housing units would definitely help with easing out the shortage, but developers can't really develop a C-class housing property, right? Like new construction tends to be A-class, maybe B-class. They can find a way, but the only solution is either more housing units or finding a way to get them to be able to afford it. So the need is there. I like to say that I started off righteously, that I was going to go and tackle that problem earlier on, but those were not my initial motives. My initial motives was just to buy rental properties, buy as many rental properties as I could on my own that would cash flow so I could get out of the rat race. And I ended up falling into the turnkey properties, and I thought I was buying C-class properties. I ended up buying D-class war zone properties. So I was working my engineering job and I was struggling with my properties on the side. And as far as incorporating those systems into the real estate investing, again, it wasn't conscientious. It was out of necessity. Like I was just looking for a way to stop the bleeding. Like every single month, I was supposed to be making cash flow on these properties, and I had to put cash into the properties so that it wouldn't go into foreclosure. So just the background on the engineering. So I studied electrical engineering, and I was going through my master's in robotics. I didn't finish it, but I was working at a bathtub manufacturer. And this company had, I think it was about 6 or 7 bathtub factories all throughout the US. And they produced the same products. And there were some different products, and there were some factories that produced some nicer tubs and some of them, some others. But there was also some variations, right?
Were these the fiberglass tubs?
They're acrylic with fiberglass backing. Yeah.
Okay.
So there's a lot of chemistry that goes in it. Just the temperature is very important. The specific down to the molecules of the acrylic that comes into the factory, that can affect whether or not if you step into the bathtub, your foot will go right through it, or the bathtub will be strong enough to support the weight of someone taking a shower. So
they're pretty fragile if you've worked with any of them, but they're the bulk of what goes into houses these days.
Very true. And I remember I got moved around within the company with product development to working on the robotics line that they had at one of the factories. And basically one of the most important parts that I remember from that company was I got to work in the process improvement team. It's basically where they focused on lean manufacturing, and lean, Kaizen, that came from Toyota. And that's kind of what gave Toyota the edge in the 80s against their competitors, is they were able to produce their cars more efficiently, cheaper, with better quality.
You were an electrical engineering, which doesn't seem to fit production engineering. So how did an electrical engineer get into the production side of manufacturing?
One of the factories had a robotics line. So there were robots that would build bathtubs, and the rest of the factories was with manual labor. So originally that robotics line was having some problems and needed some reprogramming and need some help. But after I got hired on, the management basically felt that there was going to be better ROI. Instead of focusing on that one line, it was focusing more on the quality issues that we were experiencing on the other 5 factories. So they basically trained me on those techniques, and I would do other electrical engineering tasks as well. But the main thing was, where can we automate? What type of like new equipment or technology can we incorporate? It may or may not be robots. Maybe it's just moving the materials closer to the line so that the employee doesn't have to walk every day. And, it's just like these little things, these little time wasters, if you will, it adds up, right? So looking for ways to make the whole process efficient. And the big takeaway was that it really changed my mindset, that it's not necessarily about putting in more robots and buying more equipment. Like a lot of times the solution might be right there, just looking at it differently, looking at a way to optimize and basically finding a way to make the factory run as efficiently as possible, following the Toyota methods. So when I was having problems with investing in rental properties out of state, they were in lower income areas. There were a lot of evictions. It was hard to get the tenants to pay rent after a couple months. And over time, I realized that it's very similar. We have variations, and we need to make it so it's consistent. We needed to get the property management team that can actually treat this like a factory and make it so I can spend less time on managing the operations and more time on finding more properties, working with the investors. So some of the examples, like early on, we were putting in carpet in the rentals because it was cheaper. But, after 1 or 2 tenants, if that, we have to replace it again. Or we would put in laminate countertops, but then if a tenant takes a hot stove and they put it on there, then they burn it. So it just makes sense to put in granite. And not only does it make the house look nicer, it makes it appraise higher. The lenders like that, tenants like it. And those little things add up. The other thing is on the vandalisms, just not hoping that a unit doesn't get robbed or have the copper stripped out of the unit or have the HVAC system removed, but making sure that there's a signals basically. So as soon as a unit goes vacant, the property manager knows to send over the technician to install a security system so that the police get notified if there ever is a break-in. So we make sure it's protected while it's vacant. So very similar to that factory, right? Just looking ways to automate the things that work, implement systems and procedures and, visual manuals of examples of how we want a renovation to be and down to like the specific type of material, right? And sharing that with our contractors and property managers so that everyone's on the same page. Like a factory, like even if we have management companies in different state, they're producing the same product consistently.
So just to clarify, are you targeting single family properties?
Originally, I was doing multifamily for the first 4 years of investing. And those properties, they appreciated well. The market did good, but it just became harder to focus on the lower end when the lower end, as far as like affordable C and even D class properties, when the cap rates were being compressed, because 2011 and 2012 prices very different than say 2015 or even compared to today. So around 2015 is when I shifted over to, instead of doing it apartment buildings in low income areas, doing single family houses in low income areas. And that's mainly because I had some friends that had success doing that in Atlanta. And they told me about a conference called the IMN conference where a lot of the REITs and the hedge funds attend. And I went there and I basically learned that, okay, well, there's an opportunity to manage portfolios of houses like apartment buildings. But the great thing about apartments is the investor is forced to treat it like a business, right? With a house, slumlords can get away with being slumlords, but if they do that to their apartment complex, then it's going to have a lower valuation, right? If the rent is lower on an apartment complex, then the appraiser is going to ding that appraisal. If the rent is lower on a house, it doesn't really affect the value. Just, it's more based on the condition of the property. So there was an opportunity to kind of help the slumlords retire or help the don't want to investors retire and help reposition those types of houses without necessarily gentrifying it, still renting to the same demographic.
So the conference again, what was that conference?
It's called IMN, Information Management Network. And they do that conference about twice a year. And they have some on property management and apartment investing. And this one in particular was on the single family forum. So they get the CEOs from these REITs, American Homes for Rent, those types of companies. And the other thing that I thought was fascinating is that a lot of those companies that were buying up those hundreds of thousands of houses, one of the CEOs, I remember he said that the average income of the tenants that they rent to is over $100,000 a year. And I was surprised. This was right before COVID that they had said that. They're leaving out a big chunk of the market. There's a big chunk of the market they're not serving. And it's because they know that the tenant that is earning $100,000 a year probably cares about their credit. A tenant that's earning $30,000 a year, $40,000 a year might be on Section 8. They might be working a minimum wage job. They might be living paycheck to paycheck. So it's just their systems aren't built to serve that type of demographic. And that's, I think, where the opportunity is, at least for us.
So that's INM?
I as in igloo, M as in Mary, N as in Nebraska.
Okay. And the name of the conference is what?
The Single Family Rental Forum.
Okay.
It was pretty neat because they have like vendors over there and that basically help investors like institutional level, investors with like 50 houses, 1,000 houses, or a couple thousand or hundreds of thousands of houses over there. And just kind of like getting together and talking about what works, what are the pitfalls, maybe new technologies coming into the asset class, because it's still pretty new. I'm not a fan of Wall Street. I feel like what they're supposed to do in terms of on the financial planning, it's not really the best solution a lot of times for investors, but I do credit them for really creating this asset class because prior to them getting involved after 2008, it was pretty much, you go to Fannie or Freddie and you can have up to 10 houses, but now there's commercial lenders in the space. There's more property management companies and more technology to help make it manageable.
Yeah. So it's very interesting to me what you're doing in this class, because you are trying to focus on the D and C classes, not just from the fact that you found a way to make this a good investment, but there is a huge demand for quality D and C housing. And it is a need that is not being met. There's lots of D and C class properties out there, but they are trash and they are not places that anybody wants to live. But you are trying to make these D and C classes places where people who have incomes of less than $30,000 a year, that they do have a place to go to that they want in. So take us back How are you making these places livable places at the same time that they're good for investors?
So to get to that point, it's taken a lot of blood, sweat, and tears. So I've gone through 16 property management companies with property managers, and that includes district managers, property management companies. I've had 2 property managers fire me as a client. So I cannot stress the importance of the team being essential for it, because having a property management company that's really good at managing properties in Beverly Hills, manage properties in C-class or D-class areas is basically a recipe for disaster.
They're very, very different. I mean, these are not easy properties to manage, even if they are nice houses that you're providing. So, yeah.
Correct. I would take it even a step further and say that's probably the hardest asset class in America to manage. I don't mean to sugarcoat it, but like anything, if there's a problem, entrepreneurs find ways to solve it. That's kind of like why we stay in it. I actually, even after the first couple of deals that were challenging, I tried to do some easier deals afterwards. And those were some of my worst deals, like, taking B-class properties and just flipping them and trying to make them to B+ or A. There was 2 duplexes where I tried doing that in Phoenix on, and my real estate agent ended up making more money in the deal than I did. So on the team, if there's a system in place and if there's the right team that can handle it, they already have a track record in the exact same neighborhood. They know how to handle Section 8. They know how to pass the inspections. They know how to serve the tenant. Then it's just a matter of, let's keep them busy and find a way to work together and have it keep going. The other aspect of it is on the houses themselves, just as far as making them more resilient. So we basically have to treat the renovations for all the houses identically. And that includes maybe there's going to be some houses that we might even put a little bit more money on than what it's worth at the time. And that's not something that I say lightly, but it's just the only way to survive in that is by putting granite in everything and by putting cages on all the HVAC units, by not installing any carpet.
What are you using rather than carpet?
LVP flooring. So throughout every single square inch of walkable space within the house. So that includes the stairs, both on the horizontal stair step and on the vertical. Because, on the vertical, normally that's painted. But when tenants walk in the house with their shoes on and maybe they have mud, we want to make it so that when that tenant moves out, the make-ready bill is decreased instead of having to re-renovate it every single time, even down to like the paint material. A lot of management companies will just paint with matte paint, and then you have to repaint the entire walls. But if it's semi-gloss or even glossy on like the kitchen cabinets or glossy paint in the bathroom, yeah, it's not something maybe you or I would want to have in our own home, but it just makes it so you can actually clean it, or the maintenance team can clean upon that move out. So like those types of techniques and having that in the renovation manual, like the best practices, helps improve the houses and helps us maximize the values too. So more often than not, we don't end up being underwater in the houses, but we can actually get them to a point where when it comes time to appraisal, the appraiser is actually using the comps of like the local flips versus the slumlord next door within the same neighborhood. So that helps on the valuation side of it as well.
Well, that's very interesting. I was thinking granite, wow, that must be extraordinarily costly. But then I'm thinking in these D and C class properties, there's probably not a whole lot of granite because there's small kitchens, small countertops. What about bathrooms? Are you putting granite in the bathroom counters as well?
We aren't, but we are putting some nice vanities, like these blue vanities, and it has a black top. It kind of looks like it's granite, but I think it's some other type of stone. It's not granite. It might be like a cheaper type of quartz of some sort. And the example of that too is, so we talked about the bathtubs earlier. So we don't do the acrylic walls. We put in tile walls around the bathroom.
Okay, wow.
Yeah, with like the backsplash. So it looks like the type of home like for a homeowner. And the whole idea is to make it so that it doesn't sit vacant too long. So if the Section 8 tenant, for example, if they have a voucher and they can rent, let's say $900 a month, and they have all these choices, if we can give them more than what we're charging them in rent, they have no reason to want to move out 1 or 2 years or to even go somewhere else. So we can make it so that the house can be resilient enough to handle that type of tenant, and also, nice enough for like an appraiser to want to give the value on the back end of it. But again, that came through a lot of trial and error. I mean, it was just, throwing it and whatever we could at the wall to see what would stick. But the solution ended up being getting the feedback from the leasing agents and hearing what type of feedback they got from the tenants. Like what colors did they like on the walls, or what type of materials did the tenants like more, and just incorporating that.
All right. Well, Section 8 tenants can also be screened, and I'm sure that you have a diligent screening process. It's still, even with good screening, it is still a class that is time management, as you've already pointed out. 16 property companies, that's a whole lot of companies to go through, but I can see why you've had to go through that. But I'm sure you have learned a great deal about screening property management companies. And we're going to get into a document that you are providing our viewers, and that is a property manager questionnaire. And I am sure it is excellent. I did take a moment to look at it before the program. But before we go into that, outside of property management and doing a lot of upgrades, but I'm sure you've learned how to do it as economically as possible, not just the processes that all of the homes you're going into, you're following that same process. You're doing the same materials, the same everything, and you've got a contractors who are trained to do this. So outside of property management and the houses themselves, what are some other things that you have learned about renting to this particular class that is cogent for investors?
You brought up a good point on the Section 8 tenants, and it's similar with finding the best tenants out of the pool to rent from and still adhering to fair housing rules. I should put that as a disclaimer, right. But it's similar to even finding the good management companies or finding good employees, right? Like we can't change a bad apple. One of my mentors, Beth Clifford, says, hire character and train skill. Don't hire skill and try to train character, because that's going to be a mistake. So with a lot of the management companies that we've had good relationships with and worked with for years, I spent a lot of time up front interviewing them, touring their office, asking them the difficult questions, sending them a questionnaire for review. And I've had some management companies, when they got that questionnaire and they see 100 questions on there, they call me back and they said, this questionnaire is going to take 4 hours to fill out. Look, we don't want any problem properties. I'm like, okay, well, that's good. And in my head, I'm thinking, why are they even in the business? Because the whole idea of property management is they're supposed to be there to solve problems, not just there to collect rent checks and everything be perfect. Spending the time up front is definitely helpful. On the front end, as far as like screening the tenants, we do say no more often than we say yes to the prospective tenants, especially with COVID. So if a tenant has actually been trying the last year to make ends meet, that says something about what they're going to do if there's another recession. If a tenant has just been collecting the stimmy checks and watching Netflix and they just got a job, that also tells a little bit more about their work ethic as well. Do they have a strong landlord rental history? Would their previous landlord re-rent to them? The other thing is if they owe their previous landlord or any previous landlords any rent or any money for damages, we tell them, look, you got to make it right with that previous investor, because if you don't, then you're probably going to do the same thing to us. And a lot of times, I mean, the tenants realize that that is going to be there to haunt them. So they ended up making it right. They get it paid off, or they just go elsewhere. So just being consistent and having those criteria is a big help. And some of the nightmares that I've had with the wrong management companies has been due to not enforcing that type of criteria, basically hiring anyone with a pulse and then regretting it after a couple months.
I have had some very good Section 8 tenants. And so they are out there. And if you screen for them, you can have them. Well, Sep, share with our viewers and listeners what you have to offer them and how they can get a hold of your offering and get in touch with you.
Sure. So it's a copy of the same property company questionnaire that we've used to screen our property management companies. If I can make one comment on that too, it's not just about finding a good property management company, but also about trying to be a good client for the property manager. And I think when the property management company will see those questions, and there's one question in particular, how does the property management company make money? There's another question about what is the property manager's goals within 5 years? If we can uncover that upfront in the interview process and help them reach those goals through referrals, through leaving them good Yelp reviews, Google reviews, or even offering to be a resource if any of their other clients are interviewing them, that's goodwill that ends up building up, right? Then they're going to get excited about managing your properties or about taking phone calls. So that management company questionnaire has been instrumental. and happy to share that with the guests. It does take a little bit of time to go through it, but again, it's better to spend that time up front than to regret it later on. And if any of the guests want to reach out, they can contact me at info@bekaminvest.com.
Okay. We're going to have to wrap things up. Sep, it has been very good and informative. Lots of things I'd like to go in deeper and further with you. We'll have to have you back on the show and continue this conversation. Thank you so much, Sep, for being on the show today.
It's my pleasure, Alan. Thank you for having me on.
Thank you for tuning in to Real Estate Investing Abundance, brought to you by Steed Talker Capital, a company working for passionate professionals like you to develop financial independence built on solid, passive real estate investments. As part of our effort to make the world a better place, Steed Talker Capital contributes to activities and organizations committed to better understand the equine. These endeavors attempt to enhance the human treatment of horses worldwide. Steed Talker Capital, working for a world where all creatures, great and small, flourish abundantly. For resources to develop your financial independence, connect with us at steedtalker.com.